And now I'm really excited to welcome to the stage my colleague, Oni Advincula, a very treasured member of the Center for Cooperative Media staff, who's going to moderate the next conversation, which is a really, really important one. We're going to take a look at the role that translation has played in collaboration here in Chicago. And I'll turn it over to Oni to introduce our panel and get the conversation going.
Hi, everyone. I was told we've been so quiet, so let's get loud. Welcome to our panel discussion on the role of translation in collaborations. Thank you for joining us. I'm Oni Advincula. I am project coordinator for ethnic and community media initiatives at the Center for Cooperative Media, and I will be your moderator for this session. Before we dive in, I will ask our wonderful panelists here to introduce themselves, and then we will go straight to the presentations on their collaborative translation project. Let's start with you, Jesus.
Thank you very much, Oni. I am Jesús Del Toro.
Gracias, soy Jesús Del Toro.
La Raza is a Spanish newspaper here in Chicago, founded in 1970. We have more than 52 years serving the Latino Spanish-speaking community in Chicago. And recently, we have started to do collaborations with several outlets that operate here in the city. And one very important component of that collaboration is the translations that allow us to include content originally in English, to include that in our pages and websites, and also in some degree to allow English outlets to republish Spanish content original in Spanish and then translate it into English. But we will speak about that a little.
Nissa?
Yes. Hi, I'm Nissa Rhee. I'm the executive director and co-founder of Borderless Magazine. We got our start after the Muslim travel ban as just a really quick response media project, not meant to be the nonprofit news outlet it is today. But today we publish a couple times a week on our website, borderlessmag.org. Every story is published in English and Spanish, and our Spanish online audience is about 45% of our audience. And in addition to reporting and publishing, we have two more programs. We have our Pathways program, which is creating opportunities for emerging journalists from immigrant communities to learn journalism skills and work in a news outlet. And our Immigration Reporting Lab, which is through what we're doing a lot of this translation partnerships and collaborations, where we're giving other newsrooms the skills and the tools they need to better report and serve our immigrant communities in Chicago.
And hey, everyone, I'm Jonathan Kealing. I'm the Chief Network Officer at the Institute for Nonprofit News. I oversee all of our editorial collaboration efforts in partnership with my terrific colleague, Bridget, who's in the audience here today.
Mi compañera Bridget está aquí hoy.
I work on our Amplify News project, which at various times has integrated translation into our efforts and has ambitions to keep doing that. So I'm excited to be here to hear from a couple of experts and to add our perspective on how we can do this in a way that is grounded in community and equitable and uses translation as a place to start, not a place to stop.
Thank you. Clearly, as we are becoming more diverse, racially, ethnically, and even politically, translation is also becoming more and more essential. In New Jersey alone, where the Center for Cooperative Media is located, nearly 2 million Latinos reside in the state, and an estimated 70% of them speak or read Spanish at home. And that's been the trend across the country. So Jesus, let's start with you. Walk us through it. How did this collaboration and translation started among the three of you?
Well, yes, thank you. I can say that collaboration between outlets we have been discussing this all day, but it's something that is relatively new, at least for many of the legacy outlets. La Raza, having half a century of working, is part of that tradition. But the need for collaboration in our case started when we realized, I believe, two very important transformations that we're experiencing. One is the general transformation of the outlet, because of course we have reduced revenues because advertising is going down. La Raza is a free newspaper. Also, we have a website, but we rely in advertisers, in ads sold to sustain ourselves. Then the decline in revenues meant, unfortunately, that our newsrooms shrank dramatically. This is something that happened to many outlets. Some of them are already closed, no, unfortunately, and that happened a lot, unfortunately, too, here in Chicago among Spanish publications. Hoy was a daily, then 3 days a week, then a weekly, and then unfortunately closed. La Raza has been always a weekly, but we also reduce part our content operations because revenues are.
Sí, nuestro contenido.
At the same time, the rise of many phenomena that indicates that, as you mentioned, diversity, interaction, openness to other points of view are now critical for journalism. The balancing of those all say, well, we need to start collaboration, open ourselves to have content from others in our pages and to offer our content to other outlets. And being a Spanish newspaper, that inevitably, but we do some collaborations with other Spanish outlets too. But here in Chicago, the thing means inevitably to translate. At the same time, that rationale was, I believe, happening in the minds of many, and the INN, with the Amplify project, started devoting resources to promote translations. In fact, in our case, we started interacting with many outlets with a different INN project, Lens of Livelihood, which was a project that six newsrooms here in Chicago, 7 newsrooms in Chicago collaborate to cover the first year of Lori Lightfoot, the mayor administration. No? And part of that included that some of La Raza's Spanish content was translated into English in order to be available for other outlets. And also some English texts were translated into Spanish to be available for us in order for all of us to collaborate. Then the Amplify projects continue with this effort, and any content that any of the Chicago members of INN wanted to be translated into Spanish.
¿Quisieran traducir español?
Could be translated if, of course, submitted to a space that the INN have in its website, when you can upload the content and the images, and that was available to editors that then interact with translators in order to have this done. Borderless Magazine has a critical job in this process because they were the engine that took the content, the English content that was to be translated, and then managed to work with the translators in order to have this work done, not just in terms of having them put into a different language, which is very important, but also to ensure that the content, the spirit, the things that are in each of those texts were respected, because any translations implies some sort of distortion in some way. There is this Italian phrase that says traduzione traditore, traduttore traditore, which is that translation is a treachery.
Tiene que ser relacionada al texto original.
But in fact, that happened, and then Borderless Magazine provided this editing expertise eye, and also the expertise feeling, because this is also something that is very important for a translation to work. In our case, we are a Spanish outlet, a Spanish newspaper. We report in Spanish directly with the communities here, the Latino communities in the Latino neighborhoods in Chicago. And that provides us the feeling of being part of the same community that we are reporting about. That allows a cultural understanding, a cultural competence that is very important. And when you just translate mechanically, you may lose a lot of that important part, which makes a text, a news feature or whatever, alive. Not just a pastiche or something that is mechanically transfer it to another language. That is something very important, and Borderless Magazine offers that part of the process too. And we are proud to say that some of our content was published into English. We, of course, republish more English content related into Spanish. And also, beyond this, we keep collaborating with several outlets, republishing English content translated into Spanish from, for example, Injustice Watch, City Bureau, the Borderless Magazine. And it's very good to have now a lot of growing interest in having more Spanish content, because as you mentioned, the Spanish speaking community here in Chicago and in many parts of the country is growing. Many of them are also bilingual, but the need for the Spanish and the interest in keeping reading in Spanish is not diminishing. There is something that, of course, we'll need to study better, but some say that while the English competence grow, that means like at some zero that the Spanish is going to decline. No, in fact, both are going up, at least as we are seeing it here. Well, that is something that we are doing, and I think that has been prolific because we're able to translate a lot of content thanks to what A&N offer us, because they pay the translators, which we select among journalists, bilingual journalists, because also was important to have the content translated into Spanish in this case by somebody that not just know both languages, but also the artistry or the artisanship of writing these pieces. No? And we hope that we will keep doing this more independently, together, or in a broader effort like Amplify was. And it's something that they can talk about a lot more to have a better perspective.
Now, before I go to John, let me ask you the basic question. What is the most challenging in terms of the translation process?
Well, I think the most challenging is, in fact, to keep that spirit of the text alive. Because you can know other language and translate it, but if you don't know the meaning of the words, the feeling of those pieces have, you will lose a lot. And of course, you need to know the basic components of any good journalist piece and reflect that in the text. No? But I believe that the more important thing is to have this cultural value, cultural competence preserved, no, and that in order not to make this like an aseptic generic piece that now is in another language, which is okay, but for a reader that is eager to have an article or a news feature or an interview, whatever, that really communicates more than the literal word, but the feeling, we tend to take, of course, to interact a lot with the actual people, with the individuals in our community, with the activists, and their wording, how they talk is important for us too. Then this is complicated in sometimes that you need to translate something, but it's very important to preserve it. And also, as an outlet, of course, we want a lot of more Spanish content to go out there, but also we want to keep ourselves significant, because if anybody have a lot of Spanish content, what is the place for a just Spanish outlet? But of course, we are including content coming from English outlets translating into Spanish. But also, I believe everyone has their very important position to play in this ecosystem. And we understand that if we collaborate, we enrich each other, that will be at the end beneficial, of course, for us, but at the end for our communities. Because we want to serve. The need for more content, at least in the Spanish-speaking community here, is huge. We cannot fulfill that even if we have a newsroom, of 100 people. Then we need to serve more, and that is at the end the aim of this.
I'll go back to you in a second. Now, John, with this collaboration, how do you foresee this moving forward? What's the future looks like?
Yeah, thanks, Oni and Jesus. Thank you so much for describing it so well. I think where we're headed is trying to use translation as a starting point to really encourage deeper understanding and connection with Spanish-speaking communities. And that's why having Jesus and Nissa with their just terrific cultural competency and knowledge of their community part of this is really important. Because as Jesus said so articulately, it's not enough just to translate. You have to be doing reporting for and with these communities. It's not enough just to take some coverage and slap it into Spanish and say, I'm done. And that does a disservice to everyone involved. So as we move forward, we're looking at ways to regularize this. We're looking at ways to, how do we build a financial model that makes this way more accessible, but still ensures that everyone's getting paid fairly for their work. Just to go back in history a little bit from what Jesus said, when we started partnering with Spanish language media as part of Amplify in our collaborations, Lens on Lightfoot, various other ones, a lot of times the Spanish language outlets would just add doing the translation as part of their job. And that didn't seem equitable to me, that it's just, okay, you have to do your job and the second job. And so as we built beyond that first couple, we were like, is this going to work? We wanted to build in a translation infrastructure where that's paid work that is recognized as paid work. And so we were able to partner with several local journalist translators who could be the bridge between these organizations. And as Jesus said, they were really pleased to get some content published in English. And one thing we heard from the Spanish language media was often the decision makers in this community may not necessarily be fluent in Spanish. And so that coverage wasn't being accessed by decision makers, and it was therefore marginalizing the Spanish language community. So we were really excited to be able to provide benefits in both directions,
Beneficios en las dos direcciones.
and not just a rote, let's push the content around. And so as we go forward, we are seeking additional funding, and the idea being that we can build a model where everyone pays in a little bit, it's subsidized a little bit, and we can keep this going on an ongoing basis. Because for this to really work, it has to be something that is ongoing and is part of an organic strategy. One of the outlets that Jesus mentioned was Injustice Watch. And one of the things I really love about Injustice Watch is the way they're really committed to reaching BIPOC communities in Chicago, including Spanish language communities. And so they've used translation and these partnerships as a way to start building their organic audience development strategy with Spanish language communities, not to replace any of these terrific Spanish language outlets, but just to be more a part of those communities and serve them and be with them, and not just to be assuming that everything they produce in English will be relevant to another audience, because you have to really center the community in what you're doing.
Talking about funding, we have a very important question from the audience. This is audience participation.
Yes.
Right off the bat, yay. Talk more about how the translations were financed and for how much. Remember, this model can be replicated or even perfected.
So INN secured grant funding initially from the McCormick Foundation, and then additional support from unnamed funder, and then a little bit more from Field Foundation. So all terrific funders to get this started. And we negotiated preset rates with translators in this community where we committed to pay them a certain amount every month. And I'm sorry, I don't have the exact nickels and dimes in my head, but we pre-purchased a block of words every month and guaranteed that we would pay them. In exchange for sort of prepaying a guaranteed amount, we got a little bit reduced rate over what they would have just charged if someone came in off the street and said, hey, translate this for me. And that model worked pretty well. I think, where this could go in a funding sense is where you all work together to just outright hire someone in this role. And they have a certain capacity where they can just take a certain amount of words. And we can use that together. And I think Nissa is going to talk about some of the ways her organization has been kind of optimizing how you leverage what technology can do, but without ever forgetting the need for human expertise. And I think that gives a lot of potential to the future.
I could just jump in too. I think just explaining the structure might be helpful for those who want to redo this. What worked was we had a part-timer on our staff, Claudia Hernandez, who is an amazing journalist and a photojournalist and also a dual Mexican American citizen. So, it's really important to have that the translators, have Spanish as their first language or whatever language they're turning into. So she was the one managing the 2 or 3 translators who were doing the first pass. And then Claudia was also doing an edit on it. So it's, just like we do in English, it's really important to have a second or third set of eyes on the story and not just take it for granted that the translator is doing it correctly. It also helps, Spanish is different from each country. Claudia's Mexican. We have a large Mexican population here. So that was very helpful to have, the right kind of idioms and phrases in Mexican Spanish. And, it really worked that it was about a dozen newsrooms in Chicago. They would send us, I think they had a certain number of stories they were allowed to send us each month. And they would send them to Claudia in a Google Doc form. She would pass them on to a translator, and it would be about 24 to 48 hour turnaround for that story. And then that would make it back after she does her edits on the Spanish to the outlet. And then it would also be up on the INN website for any other news outlet to republish for free. So there was, the benefit of, if I'm in Justice Watch or whatever, I'm getting my story published in Spanish, but also other people can now use that story for free, putting it back in the ecosystem. So I think, if you're thinking about money, you do need to fund the translators, but also thinking about that manager position who can edit the Spanish and oversee. And it is a lot of work managing a dozen partners. So thinking that through, someone's very organized. I think, now Borderless we launched a new website earlier this year with support from some Knight Foundation money. And we started incorporating an AI plugin to do a first pass. It's called Weglot, Weglot. It's a European product. And now that's really cut the cost and time of our translations because we do every story, everything on our website is English, Spanish. And Claudia goes through and corrects the AI because we don't want to, exactly as Jesus is saying, you never want to just trust the robot. You don't even want to trust one person translating, you got to have the second eyes on it and correcting things. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, but having that editor, I think, is really important in it.
Now that editor at the center, we've done this over the last 4 years, and editing process is really laborious. But it's very interesting what you all said about the translator is also a journalist himself or herself. How important that is.
I think it's very important because we want to be faithful to the spirit of the materials as reported, because at the end is in another language, but is the word by this reporter. Whatever they wanted to do, and we need to have that too. And if you are a journalist, you know the mechanic, you know the formats, you know you have the same vision of everything, the same perspective, which is useful. Sometimes this is something that could be also studied a lot more, and in fact it is, but the narrative in journalism is not the same as the narrative in other written, things. But also, I believe because at the end, thinking about also for the future, if we have more and more bilingual students in Spanish and English, but also in any other languages too, if we have more and more bilingual, cultural competent, talented students, as we are seeing coming from colleges, and being incorporated into the current outlets, that will enrich a lot the perspective. And maybe at some point, of course, if we have the resources, we may not need to rely necessarily in freelance translators, because our own newsrooms will be proficient And we will be able to experiment more with this kind of new technology because we will have the manpower to control them, but to really have translations that are what we want them to be. You know? And at the end, because translations are expensive. And these resources maybe will be better used and you know, if a translation is not an isolated thing that works in the periphery and then have an output, but something that is integrated into the process and help other areas of the process.
Translation is expensive, you know, money, it's getting more interesting here. So Nissa, I have a question for you. When we talk about the future of translation, we think of translation in minutes, like hundreds of words in minutes. How do you see this, like an automated translation, right? Beyond Google Translate or Skype Translate? What are the what are the impacts of that if we're not using any more journalist translators and then we resort to technology-based translator?
I mean, I think there's different ways to look at it. So like Borderless Magazine, we cover immigration and immigrant communities in the Chicagoland area. Last year, 99% of our stories were reported or photographed by people from immigrant communities. So immigrants or the children of immigrants. So the people already have these language skills, they're already reporting it. And we have a very small team, small but mighty. But our small team, we speak 7 different languages. And, you know, that is the future, I think. You know, what Jesus is saying, you know, this doesn't have to be something that you lop on at the end and you have an all English newsroom who can't do anything until the very end. You know, when we do stories, the story we published this morning, half the interviews, you know, were done by a reporter in Spanish. And it was a very, you know, back and forth process. Like the reporter gave us an edit and we did the edits in English and then ultimately fact checking in Spanish, going back and, you know, double checking things, quote reviews in Spanish, and then publishing in English and Spanish. And so it is not a kind of like straight line, I think is the future. I think the future is much more integrated, much more what Borderless is looking like, where you have those resources in your newsroom already, you're using them. And maybe the translation isn't an afterthought. So, you know, right now I mentioned, you know, we're using this AI tool mostly to help lighten the load of our translators and make things a little quicker and cheaper for us because we are so small. But it's also allowing us, you know, this year we're going to add 2 more languages to our website. And that will be really, you know, possible because we're leaning on some of the technology. And, you know, we're talking a lot about Spanish. And one of my things that, like, my takeaways for you all is really don't just think about Spanish because there's especially, you know, there's so many different communities that are not being served today because of all the news outlets that are shutting down. You know, Borderless did a research piece last year and we found half of the news outlets serving ethnic or immigrant communities in Chicago have shut down in the last decade. And even more have done so since then. So think about Arabic, think about Filipino, think about Persian or languages of refugees coming here. And, you know, those people are part of our audiences too. So we need to, you know, like us leveraging the technology and our, you know, network of reporters and community is just all part of like, how do we serve the people who live here?
Question from the audience again. Was there a focus on certain story topics for translation or just anything? Before you answer that, let's give a shout out to Martha, who's doing an awesome job interpreting.
Yeah, so it at different times it was different. I mean, we conceived this project before there was a pandemic. Then we got walloped in the face with the pandemic. And so that caused us to change gears a little bit. We did spend a lot of time trying to make sure that information related to COVID-19 was available. You know, one of the things we heard from our Spanish media partners was that the city wasn't doing a great job of making all of their COVID-19 information available in Spanish. And so we prioritized getting information related to the pandemic available in Spanish. We also, I think if there was another focus beyond that, it was just making sure that they were stories that were for and with the Spanish language community and not just, here's our big story of the day, let's translate it. It was trying to make sure that it was going to be relevant and competent for the audience we were trying to reach.
Mm-hmm. Is that the same in your case?
We publish every story in English and Spanish, and I'm just going to push back gently
Sure.
on Jonathan,
Sure.
because I do think some people approach translations as, okay, we need to translate the COVID numbers or that where to get a vaccine, and that's it. Like it's resources, or it's like only stories that have a Hispanic person will translate into Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really, that's a starting point, but I think it's short-sighted. I lived in Seoul for a number of years. I was, an immigrant there. And I didn't want to just learn about, people like me. I wanted to learn about art shows. I wanted to learn about, what was going on in the government. I wanted to learn, just normal people stuff. So I think, serving immigrant or non-English speaking communities, like you should think beyond just the resource list and beyond just like the story that features someone from that community, and think, it's a rich communities who are looking for all kinds of different stories.
When we talk about translation, first thing that comes to mind, it's Spanish to English or Korean or whatever ethnic or in language, right? What about the other way around, to English? Have you come across with that? That question is probably an answer in mitigating disinformation. You mentioned earlier about, when you translate government information, that could actually help the community. What can you say about that?
It is important because, for example, in our case that we are a Spanish outlet, we want also our content to be in English, because we will reach another audience. As mentioned, we will get an additional influence, because of course, if the government officials or the businesses or whatever doesn't read Spanish, won't know anything about what I am saying. And because our content tends to be very community oriented, we cover a lot of the fights of that community is doing in defending their rights, or all the issues that are affecting it, and the solutions that they are offering for themselves to overcome what they are fighting against. Our stories are important, and will be more if the other constituents can read them. And then for us, English translations are important. We don't do that too often, mostly because resources. We may try maybe the AI in the reverse mode, from English to English, from Spanish to English. But we did in the past several translation projects. The larger one that we have was a book that we published a year ago, and most of them was reported in Spanish. So this is the book. But we translated the whole thing into English. And because this book that covers what the Latino community did during 2020 to fight against COVID and also other issues too, but we have the benefit of having support from the Field Foundation to do the translations, but also some of those stories are also come from the Lions of Life Project. Also, some of them also from other collaborations, solving from Chicago, that has also a Spanish translation component too.
Que añadieron un componente en español. Esto fue muy importante para nosotros.
And to try to do it more, as mentioned, not just as the last part of the chain, but to do it more in a more systemic way. Because that will be at the end easier, the quality will be better, and we'll have another benefits, as a media outlet. We don't want to be transformed necessarily into a bilingual publication, but we don't know about the future. Then we want to add more in order to be able to serve better our community.
Foundations love metrics, right? How do you measure your success?
Everybody look at me. So we measured a few things. We measured the number of stories translated. We measured the research, like the pickup, because we did spend a fair amount of time, Claudia in particular, reaching out to other publishers, encouraging them to republish it. And then we also monitor for qualitative feedback, just about people who maybe learned something from the story that they otherwise wouldn't have. Those
Pickups meaning on your site, not on their site. Right?
No, pickups on across the internet, because as Jesus pointed out, once the story was translated, it was open to the world to reuse. Yeah. So we're looking at where that story traveled, using like a tracker pixel, but also using Google search and just like looking for where that story traveled to see who else was using that story.
I was doing some research for something, and I found one of our stories translated into English, but the citation includes the URL from Book Club because they republished that. And that is good because, that is also, everything is intermingled already, which is part of the aim of this collaboration.
So in other words, not only La Raza can actually publish it, but other publications.
Yeah, I mean, we worked with Univision on some of these stories. We wanted to work with Telemundo, but could never make that work. And then there are other Spanish language media beyond Borderless. I mean, Cicero and others that I don't even know in this community that we wanted to make the content available as widely as possible.
Nissa, in your case?
Yeah.
We have 5 minutes left.
I think, obviously as a news outlet internally, we're looking at, page views and that kind of thing. We're also this year, we're trying something new and taking a page from the political organizing book. And we have 2 field canvassers going out to 4 primarily Hispanic neighborhoods in Chicago, going out every weekend, talking to folks and really trying to get an understanding of their information needs and where Borderless can go next, because we have this amazing audience online already, just so organically. And, we want to think about next steps and who's being left out still, because, as Jesus said, the Spanish language media new outlets are shrinking in Chicago, even as the Latino population is growing. So we all need to do better as an ecosystem. And I think, one of the joys of this collaboration was just seeing our fellow news outlets who don't do Spanish translations realize, this is something we need to do and we should figure it out. And I think that kind of we can't do it alone, as Jesus rightly pointed out, we can't do it alone. So it's going to take an ecosystem approach, and hopefully more and more news outlets will be, trying to serve people who don't speak English.
I love that. I'm a big proponent of that. Can you imagine the hits of La Raza's or Univision? If you combine all of that, that's millions of viewers. Let's open it to the audience, please.
Hi, everybody. This is great. I wonder if you guys might speak to the full life cycle of a story. So something that I think some publishers run into if they don't have the luxury of having a staff with 7 different languages spoken on that staff. Once the translation happens, how do you work together to make sure that feedback or shares or community reaction online that's back in the language that's not the native language of, or the primary language of that organization is handled in an appropriate way? I just wonder if those collaborations extend into those moments where it's like social spaces where you're wanting to have a good dialogue with the community that you just served by translating a story.
If I could jump in, I think that was one of my other points, which we've already said, but translation alone is not enough.
Right.
Even people think are they forget about translating photo captions or social media posts or whatever. Once you open this can of worms, you need to actually be there. And, we are, like I said, very small. We have 5 people on staff, only 3 full-time. And that, we're making it work through a mix of contractors and part-time and freelancers. And, I think it is possible to do this on a very small budget. I do think you need to lean on people who do speak this language, those languages, especially for that, like the feedback part, or like, people calling us, like asking questions or needing help. If you don't speak those languages, like you can't do anything. It ends. So you need to go beyond just translation. It's really thinking about bringing those people on, even if they're just freelancers or whatever. And they're out there. There's so many people out there. There's no shortage of people who speak other languages and are extremely talented. So it might involve training them or seeking them out. But I do think it's completely possible to do it on a shoestring budget because we've been doing it.
Thanks for addressing that.
Yes, please. I think we have one more or two more questions. So let's go to you first.
With the foundation funding, I'm not sure how much you will share, but were you committed to doing a certain number of stories for a certain amount, or was it more general operating?
It was project funding, so it was not general operating support, but it was pretty open-ended. We showed them the rates and saw the amount, and we said, we have to pay Borderless and Claudia, and then we had some other things we wanted to try in the realm of social media engagement, to get to your point, Kelsey. Basically then they just said, okay, that sounds good, and there wasn't some, deep line item report where it's like, how many words did you produce and what was the rate? It was a big picture, but it was very much project funding devoted for this.
And in the case of this book, for example, we had a grant from the Field Foundation to do it. And the grant project included money for translations. But because we didn't know at the moment we sent the grant application, how many words a story will have, how many stories we will do at the end, we need to have some sort of flexibility, and they understood. Then, translation is expensive. Then you need to handle it very carefully and to plan, because if not, it can go wrong. No?
At the center, we started with one story a week. One story for Spanish, one story for Korean. That was funded by Dodge Foundation and Democracy Fund, and we got one now with New Jersey Consortium. So we're increasing the number of stories, hopefully up to 5 per week. One last question.
Hi, thanks, Oni. I have a question about what impact looks like for this kind of really collaborative approach, given that there are different audiences that now have access to some of this type of information. So you were talking about decision makers versus like people directly affected, and if you've got this translation, then you've got those different audiences seeing
A las diferentes audiencias.
stories that you've worked on.
Well, in our case, it's important because we want to serve our bilingual or some English-only Hispanics that we want to serve them a little bit too. Also to reach or to have increased reach among government officials, people who don't read in Spanish, but if they read our stories, that will be more significant for us and as our relevance in the community. And because we want to, to take steps into the future, then maybe it's not something that is going to have a big, large impact right now, but it's something that we are building for tomorrow. And that is our case.
Parting shots.
I will just say, to riff on that question, one of my big hopes and dreams for this collaboration and all of the collaborations that INN's worked on in Chicago is to help build the cross-outlet awareness because Chicago is just this wonderful petri dish of startup news organizations, many nonprofit, but not all. And I really love to see the community that supports those organizations become more aware of each other, so that we strengthen all the boats. The tide rises for everyone.
Nissa?
Yeah, I will say that I see translation and these issues of language access, access to information as a racial justice issue. And you can see, you know, the damage that when people don't have access to information in their language, you know, look at what happened at Facebook and all these different countries where they weren't, you know, translating things and moderating things. It's really important that, you know, people in our communities have access to information and to not only information, but seeing themselves in the news and presented respectfully. And, you know, one of the first reasons we started doing all these translations was because we did all these interviews in other languages. And it's really bad if you do an interview with a reporter in another language and then you can't read the story. That is like terrible feeling. So I think, you know, just having that kind of, you know, representation and access is an impact in itself. And we need to be talking more about how this is really critical to our goal, our shared goal of serving our communities.
Thank you, and thank you all.